Kia ora, I'm John Tucker, Principal of Carey Baptist College, your college. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. Some time ago I received a letter in the post. It was a letter from the Shine Foundation. That's an organisation supporting the victims of domestic violence. I don't know if you know this, but as the letter pointed out to me, New Zealand has the worst rate of domestic violence and child abuse in the developed world. The letter went on to explain that 1 in 3 Kiwi women will experience either physical or sexual violence from a partner during their lifetime. On average, police in this country attend a female or a family violence incident every 5 minutes. And the research actually indicates that 80% of incidents go unreported. A quarter of all Kiwi women will experience a sexual assault during their lifetime. And 1 out of every 3 girls will be sexually abused before she turns 16. I mean, reading those figures, I was staggered, appalled. This is so sad. And the evidence suggests that this kind of abuse and violence in our homes will breed ongoing and increasing levels of violence and abuse in New Zealand. We have a massive problem. I've got some friends who work with troubled teenagers, a ministry that they have founded and lead. And those teenagers in their ministry, the kids that they're working with have been expelled from the school system. They're abusive, they're violent, they're teenagers who have grown up in these kinds of homes, actually. And they're so desperately wounded that it seems almost impossible to imagine their lives being turned around. And I wonder if my friends are ever tempted to despair, to say the need out there, it's just so massive. Why bother? What difference can we realistically hope to make? Do you ever feel like that? But it's not just that the needs are so massive. The problem is that our resources are so meagre, and we know it, if we're honest. I started my working life as a lawyer, but then one day I was in a worship service and I heard someone reading the words in John's Gospel where the risen Christ says to his disciple Peter, "Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Then feed my sheep." Well, don't ask me how, but I just knew in that moment the risen Christ was speaking to me saying, "John, do you love me? Then feed my sheep. I want you to be a preacher, a pastor, a servant of the word." And there have, in the subsequent years, been many times, 18, 19, 20 years, when preparing a message or counselling a young adult, I've been filled with despair, if I'm honest. And I've thought to myself, I have so little to offer. What difference can I make? What difference can we make in this world with its massive needs? Do you know what I mean? Can you relate to this? You get an email announcing that one of your work colleagues has been made redundant. One of the many thousands of New Zealanders who will lose their jobs as a result of COVID-19. And you think, I've been working with this guy for over 10 years. He knows I'm a Christian, but he's never really shown any interest in the gospel. What difference am I making? Or perhaps you see in a news headline that thousands of Kiwis are marching in support of the Black Lives Matter movement against institutional racism, both around the world and here in New Zealand. And you think, maybe I should join that march. Maybe God, feels strongly about this kind of racial injustice. But if I were to get up and march and join others, what difference would it make? Do you ever feel like that? What difference would it make? Well, you're not alone. Because as we see in the scriptures, in Mark chapter 6, listen to the word of God. Mark chapter 6, verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus, and they reported to him all they had done and taught. And then, because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." And so they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, and it's already very late. "Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus told them to make all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s, taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten, besides women and children, was 5,000. So Jesus and his disciples, they find themselves in what Mark calls a remote place or a deserted place, in the wilderness, in other words. And they're surrounded by a massive crowd of people. And Mark says that to Jesus, the people were like sheep without a shepherd. Sheep without a shepherd. It's a richly evocative image. Maybe not so much to us here in New Zealand, Aotearoa, but when Mark's first Jewish audience heard these words, they probably would have evoked memories. Maybe memories of that story in Numbers 27, when Moses, having led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, having led them through the wilderness towards the promised land, is about to die. And Moses prays to God and he says, please appoint someone over this community to lead them when I'm gone, so that they will not be like sheep without a shepherd. The very same phrase that Mark uses here. Or perhaps when Mark's first audience heard these words, it might have been the promise in Ezekiel chapter 34 that flashed across the screens of their minds. Because there, God says, I will be a shepherd to my people Israel. I myself will be a shepherd to them. Through my servant David, I will take care of them, because the leaders of Israel have not taken care of them. And my people are like sheep without a shepherd. They're sick and injured. They're starving and lost. They're food for all the wild animals in the wilderness. Well, whatever the reference, in any event, when Jesus sees this crowd and he sees that they are like sheep without a shepherd, he has compassion on them. And he begins, Mark says, teaching them many things. In other words, it's a very long sermon. And eventually the disciples, they feel compelled to nervously interrupt Jesus. And they say, yeah, look, Rabbi, Master, we're in the wilderness here. It's already late. The people will be hungry. So wrap it up, pronounce the benediction, send the crowd away. They might just have time to get to McDonald's or Pack and Save before it shuts. Now, I guess on one hand, this is quite a good suggestion. And you think that Jesus might be somewhat impressed with, a thoughtful, realistic assessment of the situation. His disciples, some of them, they're young adults. This is demonstrating a measure of maturity. But instead, Jesus says to them, no, you give them something to eat. Verse 37, you give them something to eat. I beg your pardon? You give them something to eat. You feed my sheep. I can just imagine Peter's response. I can imagine him saying, "You can't be serious, Jesus. It would cost 200 denarii, about 8 months' wages, to buy enough bread to feed this huge crowd. We don't have that kind of money." And Jesus responds, "Well, what do you have? How many loaves do you have?" What difference does that make? What difference does it make how many loaves we have? It won't be enough to feed this crowd. But Jesus doesn't blink. So the disciples do a quick stock take, and it's worse than they thought. They've got 5 small little barley loaves and 2 salted fish. And they're not kingfish, they're just, fish out of the Sea of Galilee, a lake. That's not enough even to feed Jesus and the disciples, let alone a crowd of 5,000 men, plus women and children. And that's so often how I feel. I don't have enough to feed this hungry crowd. It's just 5 loaves, 2 fish. I'm David facing Goliath. I'm Peter facing Caesar. I'm Mother Teresa in Calcutta facing a crowd of dying people. I'm Kate Shepherd in New Zealand facing an intransigent parliament. 5 loaves, 2 fish. But Jesus, Mark says, he doesn't seem to be troubled at all by that. He says to the disciples, "Have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass." On the green grass. Ever wondered why Mark adds that interesting little detail? Maybe he's deliberately echoing the language of Psalm 23 here. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures, green grass." Or maybe Mark's deliberately linking this story here to the vision back in Isaiah 35, where Isaiah prophesies that one day, by God's power, the barren wilderness and the dry deserts of Israel will be transformed into a lush land of green fields where God's people can know deep rest and joy. Maybe Mark's actually saying that promise is being fulfilled in this story, in the life and the ministry of Jesus. Well, that may be the case, but the disciples don't yet know that. All they know at this point in the story, I think, is a feeling of acute anxiety, spasms of anxiety and worry and growing embarrassment as they each approach the crowd with just a few chunks of bread and fish in each hand. But Mark says their embarrassment is soon gobbled up by amazement, because with masterful understatement, really, he says, they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. Do you see it? Just as God miraculously fed the 12 tribes of Israel in the wilderness with manna and quail as they assembled in groups of 50 and 100 in the Exodus, Jesus here feeds the people of God in the wilderness with 5 loaves and 2 fish as they sit down in groups of 50 and 100. This is the Exodus all over again. Mark's saying that Jesus is the one greater than Moses who was to come. He's the Son of David, the divine shepherd, who has come to rescue his people, to care for his people, to feed his people. And he can turn dusty deserts into lush pasture lands. He can supply whatever we need. And one day, if you read on in the story, in the great banquet at the end of time, he will fully and finally satisfy our every need. He will renew and reconcile all of creation. But Mark says here, in effect, that it's already started. Yes, the call to discipleship and the call to ministry and service, the call to mission, it's a call to do what for us is impossible. Yes, the needs out there are massive and our resources are meagre, but our 5 loaves and our 2 fish are more than enough, he says, when we put them at the risen Christ's disposal. A little while back, I was involved in a forum on preaching. I had to preach a model deductive sermon. It was a model and it turns out, of how not to preach a deductive sermon. It just went terribly. I felt so discouraged, if I'm honest, a little embarrassed. But that week I received an email from one of the participants, and this is what she said. She said, "I just wanted to say how deeply impacted I was by your presentation of Luke 4. Without going into detail, it crystallized my thinking around a difficult decision that I had just made, and was the reassurance that I needed to continue down what she called the narrow, difficult road." And she went on to say, "You revealed more of God to me and His Word. It worked in my life. Thank you." Was this the same sermon? With Jesus' blessing, our 5 loaves and 2 fish are more than enough. 20 years ago, Annie and her husband spent some time studying at Carey. After graduating, they planted a church on the North Shore in Auckland. But their studies had opened their eyes to God's heart for the world, and His heart particularly for the poor. And so, with their 4 little children in tow, they relocated to India to work amongst the poor. Somewhat naively, in retrospect, they signed up for an apartment in the middle of the day. And it was only when they went for a walk at night around their new neighbourhood that they discovered they'd moved into Sonagachi, the largest red light district in Kolkata. Their new neighbours were 10,000 women forced into prostitution, many of them just as young as 9 or 10 years of age, the same age as Annie and Carey's own children. Well, as they walked around their community, Annie and Carey came to see that there was clearly a link between poverty on the one hand and trafficking on the other. And they concluded that an economic problem needed in part an economic solution. So in 2001, they opened a little textile company to give jobs and freedom to 20 sex workers. Well, all hell broke loose. There were crises every day. Women were getting beaten. Some had acid thrown into their faces. The odds were against them, but they persevered. And Annie and Carey, they persevered. And today, their free-set business employs hundreds of ex-sex workers, giving them a living wage, health insurance, a pension plan, budgeting advice, literacy training, and with it all, the good news of freedom in Jesus Christ. Eric was a young Tongan man with a huge, huge smile and an even bigger love or passion for our tamariki. In 2010, he started training at Carey to be a youth pastor. And during his studies with us, during his training, he grew in his understanding, not just of ministry, not just of how to work with Jesus to see His will done in this world, but a much richer, fuller understanding of the plight of many Pacifica peoples in New Zealand. And so after graduating, Eric and his wife Anna, they joined a UNO team, an Urban Neighbours of Hope team in Randwick Park, Manurewa. For 3 years, they worked with their neighbours to see that community transformed. They did all kinds of things. They developed a community centre. They started youth clubs at that centre. They ran a holiday program. They developed a leadership course for young adults. And in 2017, the Randwick Park community was named New Zealand Community of the Year. Such was the transformation that had occurred there. But by then, Eric, Anna and their 2 kids had moved on to a suburb down in Wainuiomata, where they are pioneering another UNO initiative in response to Christ's call. When you think about the massive needs out there in our world today, a COVID world, and when you think about the meagre resources in here, in our lives, in our faith communities, it's easy to despair. It's easy to feel inadequate. It's easy to think, why bother? What difference can we make? But hear the word of God. It's not what you have that counts. It's who Jesus is that counts. And He is the divine shepherd who is with us now in resurrection power. And He makes our 5 loaves and our 2 fish more than enough. What He said to those disciples, He says to us, you give them something to eat. Feed my sheep. Amen.